When I taught biology, there were many skills that I could measure well using selected and constructed response items on the assessments that I would design. And those were skills that involved labeling important things, defining important concepts, even solving some fundamental problems associated with whatever part of biology we were studying. But there were many big things that I wanted my students to learn how to do that I couldn't measure using just some simple constructed or selected response items. And these were things like being able to collaborate constructively with others in the class, being able to design and implement investigations where data were collected according to good scientific protocol, and then the entire experience was written up in a lab report and communicated to the class, and then connected to some of the fundamental ideas in biology that we were studying. And those were things that I needed to design assessments for that went really far beyond just asking a multiple choice question or asking a some type of constructed response item. So one of the things that I used to use, that a lot of teachers use for measuring kind of complex performances or complex collections of skills are rubrics, analytic rubrics. And I have one here that I used to use. It saved me so much time and was used very effectively as an educator. And this was a rubric that I would use to assess a biology lab report. And in this rubric, I would assess not only what the product was that my students were expected to create working in groups, the product, and that would be the lab report itself that included some of the fundamental pieces, the methods that they used, the results that they obtained, how the data were collected and how errors in data were accounted for, something about a discussion where they connected the results to the field of study that we were focusing in at the time, as well as some conclusions. That was all part of the product that I would measure and that I would provide feedback over using the rubric. But I would also use the rubric to assess the process of designing and implementing the lab experience that my students designed. And that included assessing things such as their constructive collaboration skills, whether they set up and cleaned up their areas appropriately, if they were doing labs that were inside of the lab area, indoors in general. And also I would assess their presentation skills, the development of something like a PowerPoint that included some of the important information to communicate to the class, but also their oral presentation skills and how competent the students were at that kind of communication. And again, these are things that you wouldn't ask a multiple choice question over necessarily, or be able to assess in a valid way, even using a simple constructed response item. But I would use an analytic rubric that included the specific areas that I was assessing, and I would be able to provide feedback by simply identifying the areas in the rubric where the students' product as well as performance fit. So, and I have to tell you right now that once you develop a rubric that's well designed and that works for you, and it may take a couple of years to do that, but once you do that, as an educator, it's so valuable, not just in saving you time in terms of how you assess your students over complex tasks, but also, as you're going to see in the presentation to follow, there are many other really great instructional sort of support roles that a good analytic rubric can play with the students. So in the rest of the presentation is about moving from what this class was, which focused on the rules for developing valid and reliable selected and constructed response items in typical assessments that you might administer to your students. And it's moving into some of the more complex ways that you can assess your students' some of the complex tasks that you expect them to learn how to do, and some of the performances that they will that they will sort of display in class, and that you can provide some very valuable feedback over, as well as assessing, again, in a valid and reliable way.
So, as discussed earlier, the first part of the course focused on kind of fundamental assessment concepts and constructs, and then the course moved into the rules for developing valid and reliable selected and constructed response items. And so here you see an example of a typical type of selected response item, a multiple choice math item. And of course, here's another example of a typical constructed response item. Perhaps this item might be designed to measure a student's ability to write some type of a persuasive essay. So far, I should say immediately so far, you have learned skills involved in editing poorly worded assessment directions to make them more well-written. You have learned how to edit poorly made selected response and constructed response assessment items to make them more well-written. Again, both of those sort of using the assessment development guide that is available, that the class is promoting as a tool to help you do that. And you have also, again, using those same steps of good assessment design, using those same skills, you could actually write or develop selected response and or constructed response assessment items that appropriately measure the skills, knowledge, and attitudes that are indicated within a given objective under any conditions stated that you might that might be present in the objective. So that's where we're at so far. Now we move to a very important objective, that is to construct a well-written rubric scoring guide for a given instructional goal or task. And again, we're talking about formally assessing status with respect to variables of interest, but in this case, the variables are big ones. You know, they're performances. They're a collection of skills that are being applied either in the classroom or in the real world, and you want to attempt to formally assess something that's big. And one of the most common ways to do this is to develop rubrics. And again, this was mentioned in the introduction, but we're going to say a little bit more about rubrics here, a little more detail. And rubrics are kind of interesting. When I first learned about rubrics, what I learned is that the word rubric refers to the color red, and to the fact that in some formal, at least formal religious or liturgical writings, rubrics represented some of the elaborations or directions that were given in some of these important texts to help qualify and clarify some of the steps involved in carrying out perhaps a certain part of a religious ceremony. Here I have a picture of a missal, and I was raised Catholic, so my first introduction to rubrics were the red notes that were printed in the margins of the missals that we used to guide us through the liturgy or the shared experience that we had at a Sunday service, which we called Mass. And if you're not familiar with that at all, a missal is just the kind of the guide that you use. It presents some of the pieces of the Bible or of Scripture that are used during the ceremony, as well as some of the formal prayers that are used that the congregation and the ministers move through. So it's not anything more exciting than that. I mean, the word missal. It could be more exciting, but I assure you it's not.
And you can avoid getting a lot of wrong ideas about tests if you'll just remember these is a job. That is, a sample of how well you work with certain kinds of learning material. If you do this job better or faster than other students, you get a higher score. If you're slower or less accurate, or if you can't do parts of the job, you get a lower score.
What you're going to learn about in this class is that rubrics, there are two fundamental types of rubrics. There are holistic rubrics and analytic rubrics. And in your practice, you will likely use, particularly for older students, you'll likely use analytic rubrics. And we'll talk about the different two types. Now, I'll start with holistic rubrics. And holistic rubrics are an overall assessment of a complex performance. And you're probably very familiar with the way holistic rubrics are used in the real world. Here I have some examples attributing stars to a product or to an experience like a movie or like a restaurant. Those would be holistic rubrics where you are communicating an overall judgment about a complex thing like a movie or a product on Amazon or a hotel room or a meal or an experience in a restaurant, and you boil the entire experience down to an overall rating. So that is an example of a holistic rubric. And an analytic rubric is a lot more complex, and this is a tool that you use to rate the level of proficiency for very specific characteristics of a complex performance. So in the case of creating a really good chocolate chip cookie, you have a number of what I call variables of interest related to the product. That could include number of chips, texture, color, taste, and richness. And then you could also provide some feedback over specific aspects of the process. Cooperation of making the cookies with other people, following directions, and then doing an adequate job of cleaning up. Now, there are a number of roles that rubrics play, and that's specific to the benefits that rubrics provide for educators and for students. First of all, rubrics do a very good job, if they're well designed, of communicating the goals and objectives of a learning experience. It's broken down into very, very clear sort of sub-performances, and it makes it very clear what the learners are expected to be able to do as a result of a learning experience. Rubrics also help promote self-reflection and self-evaluation, because as an educator, you could have the students refer back to the rubrics when they're at the beginning of a learning experience that's complex, when they're in the middle, when they're at the end, and you could constantly say to the learners, make sure you check the guidelines that are communicated in the rubric in order to determine where you're at with respect to developing the product as well as carrying out the procedures the way they are intended. And also, rubrics help enable effective and consistent peer evaluations. If you want other groups of students in the class to look at what some students are doing and evaluate them, whether it's a writing assignment or an investigation or a presentation or some kind of project, you can have students take those clearly developed rubrics and use those to evaluate other students' work. It does minimize subjectivity in grading because you are focusing on very specific elements of a complex task, and the learners know what those elements are in the first place. And it also makes it easier to conduct final evaluations of complex tasks because as an evaluator, as an assessor, you just have to review the product and then check off where on the rubric each of those tasks are in terms of overall performance. And so you don't have to spend as much time writing as much detailed feedback because the feedback is indicated based on what score you give to a subtask and what the description is inside of that scores box. Now, there are some limitations to making good rubrics, as I'm sure you know. First of all, it's a labor-intensive activity. Creating a rubric takes a while, and in order to do it well, first of all, you won't get it right the first time. You'll create a rubric and you'll use it during the first round of assessments, and you'll realize that there are some things that were not clear, some things that need to be clarified, some new areas that need to be assessed, things that need to be collapsed, all kinds of things related to scoring and to feedback. So you will never get it right the first time. And that's a really important thing to say. And so it's important as a teacher to be organized enough to be able to edit the rubric as you go, and even tell students early on that that assessment tool might change as it is applied to a group of projects. And of course, in order to learn whether or not it works and where it works and how it works, you as a teacher have to go through those tasks as well. And that might be something that not all teachers are willing to do. I mean, not all teachers are willing to take a new topic and to try and draft a persuasive essay, for example, that addresses a particular assigned topic. But in order to determine specifically what needs to be included in the rubric in terms of subtasks and what the subcategories are for assessment, the teacher needs to be so intimate with those tasks that they've gone through them themselves. And again, that takes time, and that takes time and energy, and those are definite limitations when it comes to teaching. Now, the steps involved in creating an analytic rubric are thus. First of all, the first step is to analyze the overall goal and to determine all of the process variables of interest, all the skills, knowledge, and attitudes that go into being able to perform a complex task. And that might include collaboration skills if students are expected to work in groups. It might include some way to operationalize creativity and determine how you're going to know as an outside observer that creativity has been employed and has been applied. If there are communication skills based on writing or oral communication, you have to be able to communicate about those in a rubric in terms of overall performances. And then you might want students to learn how to use certain resources, and that might be part of accomplishing those tasks. And so you need to incorporate all of those sub-skills into the analysis of the overall goal and make sure that all of those sub-skills are addressed in the rubric in some way. The next step, so once you identify, well, this is what I want the students to be able to learn and apply in this product or in this project, well, then you need to describe what exactly is you're going to be evaluating, what specifically. Identify clearly what the product or what a typical product might look like that you expect students to be able to create. Then you need to identify the characteristics of the best possible performance for each of the process variables of interest, and you need to brainstorm those. I use Post-it notes by the bucketful when I work on design projects related to class. And so there, for example, you might need to say, okay, this is what I want my students to learn and apply related to good communication skills. So what are those? What are the written communication skills? What are the oral communication skills? What are they specifically? And I might jot them down on Post-its and help use those to arrange what the overall rubric might look like. Then you want to identify what are the overall characteristics of the best possible product. What does that look like? What does the best possible product look like specifically? And then you create the rubric rows and columns, and we have some guidance for that. So in terms of rubric areas or rows, 3 to 7 areas should be created that represent the total performance. It might be mechanics, it might be content, it might relate to quality. And each of those rows need to communicate distinctly different skills. They need to be separated, and those skills need to be assessed independently. And you'll find this out where you didn't do a good job of all the overlap that can happen is when the first time you go to use the rubric and you realize that certain things that you're evaluating are getting scored in more than one row, and that's when you know you have to edit your row. In terms of overall criteria that you create, that would be sort of the 1, 2, 3, 4 levels, or the poor, adequate, and excellent, or something like that. First of all the areas that you create need to contain objective descriptions. You should have a mix of numerically quantifiable and descriptive words that lead to the assessment of each of the objectives in each of the levels. And again, each level needs to have a distinctly different level of performance, so that it's very clear when you make observations of a performance or of a product that you can easily categorize that performance into one of the levels of criteria that you create. And finally, in terms of content and presentation, you need to what you expect in terms of content needs to be clear when you look at a rubric. Again, both the content and the presentation, or the product and the process, needs to be assessed in a good analytic rubric. And when it comes to creating criteria that are at the high end of evaluation, or assessment and evaluation, you need to make sure that those represent skill levels that challenge the students to perform at a very high level of their own academic achievement. So if you have it's kind of an excellent level, those excellent levels need to really set a high bar.
The industrial system employed children as young as 6 and 7 in mines and canneries and airless mills. Playing in the sunshine quickly became a distant memory.
And so let's apply all of those rules to the development of an analytic rubric to assess whether or not a student, or let's say students who are grouped in groups of 3, have created a delicious chocolate chip cookie. And what do you want to teach them in order to be able to do this successfully? And what do you want to assess? What are the skills? What are the performances that you are teaching? Well, as indicated earlier, you can break this up into 2 main categories, the product and the performance. I have the product ones on display here. And again, there are 4 criteria from poor, that would be a score of 1, to delicious. The variables of interest that I would be evaluating when it comes to the product would be, first of all, the number of chips. And again, a poor cookie would be too few, or perhaps even too many chips. And if you jump all the way to the delicious end of the spectrum, there's at least 1 chocolate chip in every bite. That would be that would be at the delicious level. Although frankly, I think it should be more than just 1, but that's me. Then you have some objective statements about texture and the color. Presentation, always important in good food service. How you operationalize what the taste is, and then an identification of the richness, whether or not the students used enough butter, for example. So those are some of the characteristics or criteria that you would use to rate the specific performances related to product. And then you have the process. And I'm assuming that the students are going to be working in groups, and that what you identified on your Post-its when you were creating this analytic rubric were, first of all, that fundamental chef strategies were employed. That is, using the appropriate tools and the appropriate techniques for using those tools. So that's some of the stuff, again, that you would be teaching as a teacher and you'd be assessing with the rubric. In terms of constructive collaboration or cooperation, one of the important roles, I'll jump all the way to the delicious end of the rubric: carrying out assigned tasks, answering questions when asked, negotiating among the students. All of that would constitute constructive collaboration or delicious cooperation in this case. Following directions and cleaning up, all of those, again, super important, and things that you would be evaluating using the analytic rubric. Now, just by contrast, you could use a holistic rubric and simply take a bite out of the cookie and give it a 1, 2, 3. and at least you could give an overall rating, or you could do a holistic rubric based on the 3 categories. In this case, chef strategies, cooperation, and the cookie itself, and give that a rating from 1 to 3. And you could, again, give a total score. So in this case, this holistic rubric would address 3 specific categories. Or, again, it could be a 1, 2, or 3 cookie, and that's it. Again, I gave some examples earlier of that, but those are some examples of holistic rubrics, and you can see that that can be very valuable when it comes to assessing the overall experience, but something like this is not as useful for the learners as a tool during the learning experience, and that's why analytic rubrics can be so very, very valuable for learners. Okay, now we'll move on to the next objective in this section of the class that is going to be assessed on a formal assessment, and that has to do with portfolio assessment. And portfolio assessments can be used in conjunction with rubrics, but this is a little bit different. And so for this objective, I want you to be able to describe the different roles that portfolios can play within an instructional environment. So let's talk about what portfolios are in the classroom and what roles they can play for you. So again, earlier this presentation addressed the use of rubrics, both holistic and analytic, and now we're focusing on a form of assessment called portfolio assessment that can be used to assess a collection of performances. Portfolios can be used in conjunction with rubrics to assess individual, what we call artifacts in the portfolio. But what I absolutely love about portfolio assessment is that it focuses on learner constructions. And that is, a portfolio is a collection of artifacts, and artifacts are things that learners make. And so no matter what it is you teach, no matter what subject area and or grade level, if you can focus a good part of your class on the actual development of things, artifacts that students create, that they make, and that the act of creating those things not only provides a context for learning, but also provides a goal that indicates that they have in fact learned and applied some important skills, then personally I think you're doing a better. So let's take a look at some of the roles that portfolios play. Now, first of all, as I mentioned, creating artifacts can be a context. You can say to students that you are going to be creating, for example, if you're a science teacher, you're going to be creating some lab reports. And those lab reports have to conform to very specific guidelines, and they are going to reflect very, very intense investigations that you're going to design and carry out. And so that means that as a biology teacher, you are going to be focusing on laboratory investigations. That's excellent. You can even say the same thing perhaps if you're a physical education teacher. You could say, okay, there's a lot of physical performances I want my students to learn how to do and execute, but I also want them to create artifacts. I want my students to create a personal health plan, a personal wellness plan, an actual written artifact that includes ways in which they will incorporate some of the things they're learning how to do in PE as part of a habit of movement in their life outside of school, or a habit of, say, nutrition that translates into making good decisions about what they choose to eat or what they choose to plan to eat throughout a given amount of time. And all of that can be communicated in an actual artifact. So even though as a PE teacher you might be focusing more on psychomotor skills, you can apply those skills in a way that results in an actual physical artifact that can become a focus of your instructional efforts. And again, related to that, those artifacts can help both teachers and students set goals. They can certainly be used to assess whether students have learned and appropriately applied a set of skills. Absolutely. Portfolios provide excellent opportunities for reflection. It's very common when you develop portfolios to have students include the artifact and then answer some questions about those artifacts. It could be a reflection on what they learned how to do and what they applied when they created that artifact. It could be a reflection on what they are going to do next as a result of creating that artifact. Going back to the PE example, it would be great to have students reflect on what are they going to do with their wellness plan. How do they plan to implement it? If they have tried to implement it, what barriers or roadblocks did they meet? And what are some strategies for overcoming those? All of those are things that can be the result of reflecting on the artifacts that were developed in the first place. And of course, portfolios provide an excellent opportunity to communicate what is being learned to other people, what's being learned to the teachers, what's being learned to parents. If students have a robust portfolio of artifacts that reflect their literacy skills, that reflect their language arts skills, that reflect their social studies skills, it's easy then for a parent or other stakeholders to look at those artifacts and to say, oh, this is what this student has learned how to do as a result of the experiences that they've had in this class. Now, of course, portfolio artifacts can also be used by instructors to help them plan and manage what it is they expect their learners to do, and what do they expect their learners to develop, or where do they expect their learners to be at a certain point. Again, the physical creation of artifacts can be used as a planning and a management tool, because once an artifact is created, or if it's being created while it's being developed, then a teacher can look at the artifact and know where the students are at with respect to the skills that are being applied in that. And similarly, a portfolio or the artifacts can be used as an organization tool. And let me just give you a really good example there. I went into a classroom one time and I saw that this teacher was having their students create portfolios that were a lot of written documents. They included some tests that were taken and included in folders, as well as written artifacts, some art artifacts. But the students all had 3 folders hanging inside of a crate in the classroom. And so each student had a folder that had assignments in it, what they were expected to do, what were the assignments, what were the artifacts. When they were in the middle of working on something, then that anything that they were doing related to that was included in an in progress folder. And then finally, when they were done, when they finished something, then they moved it to the completed folder. And it was the completed folder that was the actual physical portfolio. And what a wonderful way to help model for students a really, really clear organizational strategy for keeping track, first of all, of what's expected, the assignments, what they're working on and where it is, and then also what's completed. And so you could easily see how this can translate into an electronic portfolio and how these folders can be online, absolutely. And one great thing about that is you can make those folders public inside of a cloud space, and all stakeholders, parents, teachers, students, can all have access to those different folders as needed. So again, what a great way to use the physical act of creating artifacts as a way of actually organizing the learning process. I just love it. And finally, the last thing I want to say about portfolios, and again, this relates to what's in the course text, and that is that there are 7 key ingredients to portfolios, and let me just quickly review them for you now. First of all, you want to cultivate ownership, and that is you want to provide many opportunities for creative expression and self-reflection. So that is what the students create is theirs. What they're making are the result of their efforts, their ideas, their creativity. So anything you can do to make the portfolio very personal, you want to try to do. And related to that, you want to ensure that a wide variety of artifacts are included in those portfolios. Again, they're based on what role the portfolio is playing in your class. But a wide variety of artifacts is good. Create a clear, simple organizational scheme, as I mentioned. Assignments in progress and completed is a great organization scheme. And what a great thing to include in the assignments folder, an analytic rubric that clearly communicates what is expected by the end of that creative experience. And again, clearly identify and communicate how they will be evaluated. And I think analytic rubrics are perfect for that. It's also important as a teacher to compel the learners to continually evaluate their in-progress work. So the cool thing is, if it's organized this way, then they know where it is. And so they can get to it. And again, it's important for the teacher to have the students continually go back and evaluate where they are with result to that. It's also important for teachers to schedule and conduct portfolio conferences. And again, in the classroom where I saw the physical use of folders, this was so easy because the teacher was just sitting there next to the crates and called up students individually when they had an opportunity, and the students sat down and the teacher just pulled out the folders, the 3 folders, and looked at where they were, looked at their schedule, and conferenced about the status of all of those things. And finally, and this sort of connects to something I said earlier about e-portfolios or online portfolios, you can involve parents in the portfolio assessment process. And that means that parents can go in and see where their students are at. You can ask questions in a portfolio that only the parents can answer. And as a teacher, you can make those connections. And so the entire experience of assessing the learners in terms of acts of creation becomes something that's a communal effort. And isn't that the way it should be? Isn't that the way it is in the real world? So portfolios and the use of analytic rubrics as part of portfolio artifact development can be very powerful ways to, in a valid and reliable way, assess learner performances.